Is the U.S. losing patience with the Ukraine war? This week, the New York Times, citing American officials, played down the odds of a victory in Ukraine's coming spring offensive. The New York Times said that Ukraine is preparing to launch a counteroffensive against Russian forces as early as next month, in the face of immense risks. Without a decisive victory, Western support for Ukraine could weaken, and Kiev could come under increasing pressure to enter serious negotiations to end or freeze the conflict. If some officials in Washington are starting to distance themselves from the outcome of the Ukraine war, it may be because of the realization that the war is increasingly only a small part of a bigger war the U.S. is engaging in, waged between the unipolar war order and the multipolar one. The bigger war pits the global north against the global south. The outcome will reshape the world as we know it. The stakes cannot be any higher. To understand the economic and market implications of this war, we need to understand its scope and which countries are involved, directly or indirectly. Before we can say which side has the upper hand or is even winning, we need to define success and how to measure it. It was not so long ago that the term global north-south divide was mostly understood as a generalization of the geographic disparity in economic development. The countries in the north are richer on average, and the countries in the south are poorer on average. Until recently, the term had a limited political association. Despite the fact that the north had once colonized the south, globalization was allowing many countries in the south to play catch up with the north. Then the meaning of the north-south divide began to change. First was the US trade war on China. Then came the US-led sanctions on Russia. All of a sudden, every country on the planet had to decide which side they were on. As a result, a new political north-south divide is emerging. The global north had mostly sided with the US. This includes Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Great Britain, and the countries inside the European Union. These countries have a combined population of 1.3 million people, and that accounts for nearly 60% of world GDP in US dollar terms. Not all of Global South has sided with China and Russia, but many have, in most cases discreetly, for obvious reasons. So which countries are they? Scholars have long used voting patterns at the UN to measure geopolitical alignment. For the purpose of this video, let's just look at how countries voted in the UN resolution on the first anniversary of the Ukraine war that called for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. 6 countries other than Russia voted against the resolution and 32 countries abstained. The 6 countries that voted against the resolution, like Syria and Mali, are too small to move the needle either way. So let's just focus on the 32 that abstain. In Asia, they include the 2 largest economies on the continent, China and India. They also include Vietnam, the fastest growing economy in Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Iran. In Central Asia, they include 5 of the former members of the Soviet Union: Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. In Africa, they include half of the 20 largest economies on the continent, like South Africa, Algeria, Ethiopia, Angola, Congo, and Uganda. But these 32 countries are not the only countries in the global south that are quietly rooting for the multipolar camp. With Brazilian President Lula da Silva openly calling for an alternative to the US dollar for international trade, and on the record saying both the US and Ukraine should also share the blame for the war, Brazil should be considered as at least strongly leaning towards the multipolar camp. Then there are, of course, the countries in the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia and Qatar recently became dialogue partners of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization led by China and Russia, while UAE and Kuwait are on track to join this year. Washington Post reported this week China has resumed building a military base in the UAE. China is also the biggest export market for Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Russia, of course, is a key member of OPEC+. Altogether, these countries in the global south have a combined population of nearly 4 billion people and a combined GDP that accounts for about 30% of the world GDP in US dollar. The new rivalry between the 2 competing global blocs has already resulted in a change in the pattern of international trade. So what are these changes? One, US and China are both importing less from each other. The big increase in US tariffs on imported goods from China has reduced US imports from China since 2018. Over the past 5 years, China's share of US imports has shrunk from 21.5% to just 16.5%, a decline of a whopping 5 percentage points. China's market share in the US is now at the lowest level in nearly 15 years. Likewise, China is also importing less from the US. Since 2018, US share of total Chinese imports has shrunk from 8.5% to 6.5%, a decline of 2 percentage points. The fact that China has lost more market share in the US than the US has lost market share in China might lead us to conclude that the US has the upper hand so far. But is this the right conclusion to draw? Many Chinese firms have relocated the assembly of their finished goods to other countries, including countries in the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, for re-export to the US to get around the tariffs. This could be behind the 3 percentage point increase in ASEAN's share of US imports since 2018. It is difficult to quantify this indirect trade, but the fact that Chinese exports to ASEAN and ASEAN exports to the US have become more correlated since 2018 lends support to many anecdotal examples of such behavior. The same is also going on in Mexico, where Chinese firms have been building factories. A good example is the state of Nuevo León, the largest recipient in Mexico of direct foreign investment since 2021, after Mexico City. 30% of their FDI are now coming from China. The governor of Nuevo León recently declared that his state is benefiting from a geopolitical planetary alignment. What all this means is that the loss of China's share of US imports is probably less than it looks. More likely, the loss of share of the US and China in each other's market is similar. Two, the informal Global South alliance has allowed Russia to circumvent Western sanctions. There's a big debate going on about exactly how well or how badly Russian exports are doing under the Western sanctions. Understandably, many people distrust Russian data, even though Russia may have just as good reasons to lowball their numbers as to highball them. Bloomberg News uses tanker tracking to create an independent time series for Russian crude oil seaborne exports. This series tells us that Russian oil exports have recovered recently to their 2022 high. This is clearly an indication of strong demand and the willingness of Russian allies in the Global South to continue to do business with Russia. Of course, there's still the question of how much Russia has been receiving for each barrel of oil, given the price cap set by the West. The fact that Russia is exporting a lot of oil does not mean that it's getting much money for it. Put differently, countries buying Russian oil could be only doing it because it's cheap. We can use the direction of trade data published by the International Monetary Fund to try to get more clarity on this issue. The great thing about this data set is that it allows us to cross-check Russian trade data from Russian sources. This data set allows us to compare what Russia is telling the IMF about how much its earnings from its exports with what the rest of the world is telling the IMF about how much they're spending on Russian imports. You can see these two series plotted on the same chart. And surprise, surprise, Russian exports from trading partners are quite a bit higher than reported Russian exports from Russia. Indeed, the series from Russian trading partners suggests that Russian exports are still at about $47 billion a month, which means it's earning more than it did before the war and the sanctions. This is not a proof, but an indication that countries may be paying a higher price for Russian oil than the price cap suggests. If true, could this be an indication of goodwill towards Russia among some of its discrete allies? 3. The combined trade balance of the multipolar alliance has improved at the expense of the combined trade balance of the unipolar alliance. Before the pandemic and the war, America's unipolar alliance was running a small combined trade deficit of about $30 to $40 billion a month for a decade. This deteriorated sharply during the war, but has improved since. However, the combined deficit is still more than double than before. In contrast, the multipolar alliance, which was already running a combined trade surplus, saw the surplus improve dramatically after the outbreak of the war. The surplus has since shrunk, but is still higher by about 50% than before 2020. Some of this dynamic reflects the gyration in commodity prices, but it is also a reflection of the fact that some of America's most important allies, like Germany and Japan, now have to pay more for their energy needs. It is too early to say definitively, but we cannot rule out that the deterioration of the combined trade balance of the unipolar alliance also reflects the loss of competitiveness of the exports of these countries that are already facing increased competition from the global south. It will take time for us to know if the improvement in the trade balance of the multipolar alliance at the expense of the trade balance of the unipolar alliance is permanent. If it is, this will have important implications for the relative growth and market outlook between the two rival blocs. My money is on the multipolar alliance. If you got something out of this program, please hit like and subscribe to my free YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about my investment strategy, come visit us at davidwuunbound.com. Thank you for listening.